Namaskar, everyone. A very cheerful evening to one and all. I, Animesh Nagar, welcome you all to this day's third and last session, Wokeism, the anatomy of protest culture. I believe you all have had a very great evening, a very great afternoon, and a very warm morning with all the beautiful cultural performance we have had on this stage, the beautiful Malcolm performance, the amazing cultural performances, and a great variety of interactive discussions in this serene campus. Wokeism, the word, the trend, the fad, cancel culture, road blockages, gender discourse, justice, poverty. All these words, we hear them in news, in newspapers all day and all around. What are all these? The Cambridge Dictionary defines wokeism or wokery as a way of referring to acts and opinions of people who are especially aware of social problems such as racism, inequality, used by people who do not approve of these acts and opinions. And how fortunate we are to learn about this topic with great clarity from eminent speakers who not only make us understand about wokeism, but will also guide us to the core of the protest culture, which have become a frenzy tool rather than a way to show a normal discontent, which is a fundamental right, after all, towards public policy or the narrative set by the state. Let me introduce you all to today's speakers. Shri Sandeep Balakrishna. Sandeep ji is the founder and chief editor of online journal on Indian history and culture called The Dharma Dispatch. He has authored 5 best-selling books on contemporary issues and topics: political, social, historical, and religious analysis. Also a veteran IT and media professional with over 17 years of professional experience in world-class organizations such as Honeywell and Cisco. He is a popular speaker on cultural, socio-political issues and Indian history on several forums and institutions, including IIM Bangalore and IISc Bangalore. He is a syndicated columnist at The Pioneer, First Post, Daily O, amongst others. He has also founded, edited, and published several magazines. Some of his very famous works that we all have read are Tipu Sultan, The Tyrant of Mysore, 70 Years of Secularism, Unpopular Essays on the Unofficial Political Religion of India, translation of Avaran, and Invaders and Infidels. We welcome you, Sandeep ji. I request Srishti Shokshe ji to welcome him.
अच्छा रिलीज की 2-3 फोटोग्राफ्स मेरे साथ शेयर कर दीजिए आज मैं यूनिवर्सिटी में शेयर करूंगा
Can take it back.
Dhanyavad, Srishti ji. Our second speaker, our second panelist for today, Dr. Saumya Day. He has done PhD at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His primary research interests are intellectual and cultural history. He has till date authored 3 books: Becoming Hindus and Muslims, Reading the Cultural Encounter in Bengal from 1932 to 1905, The Cultural Landscape of Hindutva and Other Essays, Historical Legitimacy of an Idea, and his latest book, the second edition of Narrativizing Bharatvarsh and Other Essays. We are honored to have you today, Swamiji.
थैंक यू
I request Rimjin ji to welcome him.
ठीक है
Thank you, Rimjin ji. Our third speaker, who is also the moderator for today, Professor Ram Sharma ji. He'll be arriving here in a few minutes. Till that, I can request the speakers to introduce the topic and start with the discussion.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. So I look forward to having a great interaction with you on this very relevant theme, which is wokeism. And by the way, please permit me to speak in English. I do speak Hindi conversationally, but I don't think my Hindi is good enough for me to hold forth on this topic, on an academic issue, that is. So to begin with the etymology itself, the origin of the word and what it signifies. So, as you've been told already, wokeism or wokeness stands for the protest culture. But how exactly did this term, come to signify protest culture? Come to think of it, woke is the past tense of wake, isn't it, as we learned in school? So how come this word came to signify protest culture? So as far as I know, this usage probably goes back to the civil rights movement. And this was originally an Afro-American usage, actually. Woke stood for alertness. It signified alertness with regard to social injustices, being awake with regard to social injustices, so that you do not miss them, so that you fight, contest them. So that is how, the term came to signify protest. And today it signifies, of course, an entire culture of protest. Sandeep ji, let me just quickly summarize my views on wokeness, on wokeism, and then I'll hand over the floor to you. As you've been told, the second edition of my latest book, last book rather, Relativizing Bharatvarsha, is out. It is an expanded edition, and in this expanded edition, I have included a chapter on wokeness, which is titled The Intellectual Pedigree of Wokeness. I've tried to understand wokeness from the history of ideas point of view, because as you've been told, my primary research focuses are intellectual and cultural history, and both are made up of ideas, isn't it? Culture comprises ideas, intellectual trends, intellectual ambiences in any society comprise ideas. So I've tried to understand wokeness or wokeism in this chapter that I just mentioned from the point of view of a history of ideas. And the position that I take in this chapter is that, wokeness or wokeism is actually a decayed form, is a decayed manifestation of certain very basic liberal notions. At the root of wokeness or wokeism lie these very fundamental, very basic liberal notions which emerged 17th century onwards. What are these notions? Well, these notions are regarding state and sovereignty. These notions represent a radical reimagination of a state and sovereignty. And this radical reimagination of state and sovereignty, of what they ought to do, ought to achieve with regard to a society, was done the 17th century onwards, John Locke onwards, as I try to explicate in this chapter. So, as we learned back in college or in the civics class back in school, John Locke argued that civil society or the commonwealth or the state comes into existence when human beings merge their freedom and property in the social body, so that freedom and property are secured. Then again, namaste.
Can I just...
Then again, Thomas Hobbes, took a roughly similar position. He argued that, struggle for power was endemic in the state of nature, and it made human lives nasty, brutish, and short. And to escape this endemic struggle for power, human beings submitted to the Leviathan, that is the state. Now, what is significant about these positions is that in both cases, these thinkers, namely John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, argued or imagined that the state emerged when human beings took a radical departure from the state of nature. On the other hand, if you look at classical theory, for example, if you study a classical thinker such as Aristotle, he thought that the state is an aspect of the state of nature of human beings. He argued that the state is a natural emergence from the family and the village. So in this sense, the positions taken by these liberal prophets, as I would term them, was very radical. It was a radical reimagination of the state, because they reimagined the state as purely an instrument of utility, not as a manifestation of human morality. For example, in the 19th century or in the late 18th century, Hegel took a similar position. He termed the state an aspect of the spirit. And I paraphrase this position as to mean that the state is an aspect, is a manifestation of collective morality, moral imagination, or cultural imagination of human beings. But these liberal thinkers were not taking this position. They were reimagining the state as purely an expedient creation, purely an instrument of utility. This position was later reiterated, by people like Jeremy Bentham and Rousseau in the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham, ascribed to the state a purely utilitarian role. He developed the fundamentals of utilitarian philosophy, or what he termed the philosophy of a general utility. He thought that the fundamental objective or the fundamental purpose of the state is to promote activities which engender pleasure and to curb activities which engender pain. Then Rousseau thought that the state or civil society or sovereignty emerge out of a social contract. The civil society emerges when human beings submit to it, they alienate some freedom to it for the sake of peace and security. So once again, I emphasize at this point that these thinkers were reimagining the state, reimagining sovereignty as purely instruments of utility. They were empowering the subjects or the citizenry to make demands upon the state. Now, this is a prominent aspect of the social phenomenon or the civil society phenomenon that we today term wokeness. It is all about making constant demands upon the state. It is an insurrectionary attitude with regard to the state. Think of what happened in JNU some years ago. I am an alumnus of a JNU, by the way, but an ugly incident took place there in 2016. Yeah, an ugly incident, a very ugly, unseemly incident took place there in 2016 when certain students, chanted these slogans, "Bharat tere tukde honge." What does it signify? It signifies an insurrectionary attitude towards the state. And this attitude is a very decayed, decomposed manifestation of the positions which have been ascendant since the 17th century. These positions reiterated or reimagined, as I've been repeatedly saying, the state as a purely expedient creation, an instrument of utility, which can be done away with if you wish. So I emphasize once again that wokeness is a manifestation, is a decayed manifestation of certain very fundamental liberal notions. Then again, another very fundamental liberal notion, which is the cult of individuality or individualism. It was introduced in the 19th century. Definitely in the 19th century by thinkers like Thomas Paine and J.S. Mill. Thomas Paine formulated a radical theory of rights, natural rights, civil rights, which ought to be provided to every human being. So rather, he thought that every human being is entitled to these rights. J.S. Mill thought that human personality develops best through individualism. So the cult of individualism or individuality was introduced in liberal discourse in the 19th century. First, certain thinkers empowered the subject population, subject body, or citizenry to make demands upon the state. Later, thinkers like Thomas Paine and J.S. Mill empowered the individual, the human individual, to make demands upon the state and the social body. And then came by Karl Marx in late 19th century, who morally invalidated the existing state form altogether by arguing that it is a manifestation of, it is a cynical manifestation of the existing property form and the capitalist production
Saumya,
relations.
excuse me. Hello, can I just introduce the third panelist and we can continue with the discussion there?
What did you say?
Can I just introduce the third panelist and we can continue with the discussion?
Okay. I was about to wind up, but please go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So, introducing our speaker cum moderator for today's session, Professor Ram Sharma. He is a postgraduate in management as well as literature. Since 2004, he has been engaged in working with various facets of Indic issues and studies. He is credited with having started the trend of recording talks on Indic issues while working as the secretary of India Inspire Foundation. At Center for Indic Studies, he is responsible for channelizing ideas and providing creative direction for achieving goals at the center. He is also the curator of Dharma versus Religion project. He is also mentor to the Young Thinkers Forum. It's a privilege to have you amongst us, sir. I request Anushka Dubeji to welcome him.
May I?
Namaste. Okay. Now green is replaced with saffron.
Yeah. That's meant to charge you up.
Yes. I was saying that green is perfectly replaced now by saffron. Thank you for this.
Also, it is a great pleasure that we have the distinguished author amongst us, Dr. Saumya Day. We are going to unveil his second version of the book, Narratizing Bharatvarsh and Other Essays. I'd request to bring the big books for unveiling.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, respected panelists. We can continue with the discussion. Thank you.
This is revised.
Give it.
I'll keep this.
Okay, so I'll just quickly wind up. As I was saying, in the end, towards the end of the 19th century, came by Karl Marx. He invalidated the existing state form altogether, by arguing that it is a manifestation of private property and capitalist production relations. And he urged the proletariat all over the world to overthrow this state form. So the fundamentals, the groundwork of what we term wokeness today was laid by the end of the 19th century. That is, the moral premises, to the extent that these are moral premises for an insurrectionary attitude, a generally insurrectionary attitude towards the state and society, were laid by these thinkers. And frankly speaking, I term Karl Marx or Marxism a rebel child of the liberal tradition. It is an offshoot, it is a mutant offshoot of the liberal tradition. It is not very distinct from it, actually, as far as the fundamentals, the basics are concerned. Now, coming to the 20th century, the woke attitude was introduced into academia by the scholars at the Frankfurt School, especially by individuals such as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Horkheimer, for example, he wrote a tract, a slim pamphlet in 1937 or 38, termed Traditional and Critical Theory. And by theory, in this case, he meant knowledge production in general. He argued that traditional knowledge production has been sustaining and upholding the capitalist production relations, and he wanted a new kind of knowledge, a new epistemic tradition, which would play a socially progressive role. Then his colleague at the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, he did extensive critiques of cultural production in the West, and he said that cultural production in the West was an instrument for capitalist consumption, had become an instrument for capitalist consumption, the large-scale consumption of goods. So an insurrectionary attitude, a critical attitude, was introduced into higher academia by these colleagues. And this attitude exploded 30 or about 25 years later in the 1960s, when advocacy became the trend in Western academia. And probably it was to some extent due to a disillusionment with the traditional party-oriented Marxism. And this disillusionment occurred after the 20th Party Congress, which was, I believe, in the year 1953, when Khrushchev owned up to the crimes of Stalin. So a lot of people, a lot of progressive intellectuals and students who were Marxists, and once upon a time were party-oriented Marxists in the Western universities, were disillusioned. They retained their Marxism, but at the same time took up various forms of cultural advocacy, social advocacy. They critiqued the traditional gender roles, they promoted alternative sexualities, and so on. In more recent times, wokeness has been exacerbated, it has been worsened, or amplified in academia by postmodernism, which is all about the valorization of subjectivities. And all around us, we see the proliferation of genders, the supposed genders. What are these genders, These are subjectivities. You imagine yourself to be a human being of a certain kind, of a certain gender, with a certain sexuality, even if there is no scientific premise for this imagination. The subjectivity in itself is sufficient. So there is a proliferation of genders. Last heard, there were 65 genders or so. So over to you, Sandeep ji and Ram ji.
Yeah. Thank you. So, good evening at the outset. Thanks for the Young Thinkers Conclave. I'm honored to be here amongst all of you. And after this such a wonderful academic performance, I don't know how I'll do. But let's see how it goes. So, the topic we've been given today is quite interesting, the title itself. It says, Wokeism, Anatomy of Protest Culture, which is where we can begin. I will rephrase the title. It is Wokeism or the Anatomy of Deliberately Engineered Social Insanity. So this is what it is. The rest of my submission will essentially be an expansion of that. So I remember reading a story. It is a real life incident, not a story, which dates back to more than 100 years. And it happened in a town called Mulabagal in near Bangalore. A small village, back then it was a small village, now it's a big town. So there were a bunch of school teachers, very poor school teachers, hardly any salary. So they sent out a petition to the government. It was a British government, and they sent a petition asking for a salary hike. And what was the salary hike they demanded? Not demanded, they requested. It was a princely sum of 2 rupees per month. They kept writing petitions, kept writing, and they got no response. Then they would get some response saying, we'll look into it. The Babu culture, basically. We look into it. Finally, they got the hike. After 20 years. And you know what they did? Once they got the hike, they called the entire village into the Hanuman temple in the temple in Mulabagal, which is a famous, very ancient temple. They called all the villagers, did a small utsav and puja, and celebrated the prasads to all the villagers. These teachers, small, high school, middle school teachers, they waited for 20 years to get a hike of 2 rupees. Imagine the rate of inflation for 20 years. Okay? It never occurred to these teachers to actually go out on a dharna or protest or break stones or indulge in public vandalism. These are the teachers who created students like Saram Vishweshwaraya. So, protest was a word which was not even in their dictionary. And therefore, they created such students. What are the kind of students that teachers are creating today? They are the woke zombies. Essentially, that is what it boils down to. And as you know, I'll continue in my submission, will unravel some threads of how this all goes. But at the heart of the issue, or rather one of the practical ways of spreading this woke nonsense is done on the ground by teachers, unfortunately. It's a great pity for a country which prides on its educational heritage. So when you say any word, if you add the suffix ism, you qualify any word with the suffix ism, it is a prison. So when you say woke plus ism, you get wokeism. Right? When you say authoritarian plus ism, authoritarianism, each time you have this word ism, right? You take it from me, be sure that it is a political ideology. And it is not a good political ideology at all. So when you say Hindu plus ism, you automatically distort it when you say Hinduism. It is not that. It is, Sanatana Dharma is anything but political. So these are some of the small clues that, we can keep in mind. And then the other word in today's topic is the term protest culture, which is a misnomer and an oxymoron in itself, because you can't use both the words together and still pretend that it is somehow culture. It is not. It is the absence of culture. A protest can never be culture. Look at the dictionary meaning of it and the sense in which it has been used. Because culture implies a lot of profound things. Among others, it implies patience, sacrifice, meditation, and a lot of spirituality, a lot of other profound things. What do you think built the great Mahakala temple in Ujjaini? Protest? So, ultimately, protest is aimed at building something which is far bigger and far greater than ourselves. It's like how the art that is created by an artist becomes greater than them. This is the message of Bharatavarsha. And fundamentally, at the level of our, what you call bhava, feelings, impulses, protest is the outcome of an agitated mind, a mind which is perpetually agitated, which knows no rest, which seeks to destroy an existing order. This is what protest ultimately aims at. Destruction. Give me one example throughout human civilization where protest has built anything at all. Just one example. In the past, protest would lead to what is known as revolution. What happened to the French Revolution, for example. People were guillotined. They overthrew an existing tyranny and replaced it with a newer tyranny. This is what has been happening. So protest has never built anything constructive throughout history. And in our case, in the case of Bharatavarsha, protest is not in the Hindu DNA. Show me one example where revolutions have happened, before we got something called, alleged democracy, but that's a different topic. So we never had revolutions at any period in our long history, which is at least 7,000 years old. And the only place where the word protest, both in theory and practice, where it has any meaning, is when it combats injustice. That is the only valid place where, protest has some kind of meaning, both in theory and practice, like I said. And the classic example of protest which has had some kind of meaningful outcome is the heroic and the noble fight of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh against emergency. The RSS never indulged in any kind of violence, street violence, political violence, nothing. But still we tided over the emergency. And in that context, we also have a history of protests. Unfortunately, after India attained independence, from 1947 till now, India has never known a single decade of peace. So from peace comes stability. And I think Nandkumarji is here. He was mentioning something about how cancel culture is equal to cancer culture, and I fully agree with him. Now we come to the other term of today's topic, which is woke. Woke is nothing new. I think Saumya ji traced the intellectual history of that in a brilliant way. This what is today is known as wokeism. It is a new incarnation of an old leftist monster. And in our specific case, in the specific case of India and especially the Hindu society, look at what all aspects of our society and culture that the left has been continuously attacking. You will find that it keeps attacking. Even today it is attacking in different forms. It attacks only those things which keeps the Hindu society united. As simple as that. Why does the left, decade after decade, our sacred deities are attacked? Sri Ramachandra is presented as some kind of in very derogatory and ugly terms. Nude paintings are made showing some kind of perverse relationship between Sita Devi and Hanuman. So all these things are classical music. The latest joker has come, T.M. Krishna. So all these things keep us together. So this is why the left and the so-called woke guys are attacking them. And we have to look at this phenomenon at all these levels. So, and they don't stop at it. The one thing the woke does is that it keeps inventing rules. There are no rules of engagement. They make the rules as they go along. So how do you fight this monster? We'll come to that later. Anyway, so coming back to this kind of protest and wokeism and other things, unless you have stability, you cannot achieve, a society or a country as a whole cannot achieve anything meaningful or constructive. And stability comes from people or from a society or culture who subconsciously agree with some fundamental values. Satya, Dharma, Artha, all these things that are in our DNA, which were kept in practice, but owing to a lot of invasions and other kind of assaults, we have even lost the ability to articulate them, much less practice them. So those are all different reasons why this has happened. But unless a society agrees with some fundamental values, how are you going to build something that is stable? It's simply impossible, because you're in a constant state of agitation. That is what protest is, right? You keep moving on to the next so-called battle, and in the context of fundamental values. This is again what the woke, whatever the left, they're all illegitimate children of the far left. So the woke culture says that there are no values. How do you fight them? You say that you have to speak the truth and be good to your parents, this kind of thing. They say these are all outdated things. So this is where these are the levels you have to challenge them. And I'll just close my submission with a brief point. I think Saumya ji also mentioned this about the terminology that the so-called wokes, invent. Sitaram Ji Goel, he has written a beautiful book on perversion of India's political parlance, in which he has a section which is titled Words Which Defy Dictionaries. Okay, he gave a list of different terms that was applicable to that era, which still holds good today. So these guys are very good at concocting new words which have no meaning, no settled meaning in any dictionary. Right? What do you mean cisgender? What do you mean fat shaming? I'm fat, fine, I'm thin. What can I do? So you take it is at the social manifestation, how it operates in society is that you politicize the personal and personalize the political. So you're left with no agency, you're left with nothing to agree upon. You can't see eye to eye with each other. So every other stranger that you come across in society is a potential enemy or an oppressor. I'll, give a break to my thing at this and then we'll see how it goes.
So I think I can continue now. सभी को नमस्कार. और मैं मध्य प्रदेश में हूँ, मैं इंदौर से ही हूँ और क्योंकि ट्रेनिंग रीडिंग राइटिंग लिसनिंग सब इंग्लिश में होती है, एकेडमिया इसी तरह से काम करता है. सो पार्डन इफ आई go into the track of speaking English. Meanwhile, I explain things in Hindi also. Sandeep, Balakrishna ji के बाद में बोलना because I just love to listen him. The way he was narrating, it was brilliant exposition. And Saumya's command on this subject is really brilliant. My understanding is, let me give you definition and then we'll come to one important syndrome. And maybe extending what Sandeep said right now. So what is woke? So woke, according to me, is a grand conspiracy theory born and brought up in an academia, especially humanities department, having cultural, linguistic, social studies, with an aim to dismantle culture and social fabric of society, using students as their mercenaries.
Absolutely.
हमें ये पता होना चाहिए कि उनका ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है, हमें ये पता होना चाहिए कि उनका ओरिजिन कहाँ पे है, क्योंकि हमें उनकी अगर रूट्स नहीं पता होंगी, उनका ऑब्जेक्टिव पता नहीं होगा, तो बिट्स एंड पीसेस में हम कभी भी फिगर आउट नहीं कर पाएंगे कि ये फिनोमेना है क्या, क्योंकि ये फिनोमेना इतना रीसेंट है. ऑफ कोर्स एज संदीप वाज सेइंग, एज सौम्या जी इज सेइंग, दिस इज म्यूटेशन ऑफ अर्लियर टोटलिटेरियन आइडियोलॉजीज, बट दिस इज समथिंग आल्सो वेरी न्यू इन इट्स अवतार. व्हाट इज दिस? क्योंकि ये बहुत कंफ्यूज करता है, बिकॉज आई रेगुलरली इंटरेक्ट विद स्टूडेंट्स. उनका क्वेश्चन होता है, तो ये तो अच्छी बात कर रहे हैं, इक्वालिटी की बात कर रहे हैं, डाइवर्सिटी की बात कर रहे हैं. इनफैक्ट उनके कुछ फेवरेट्स वर्ड मैं आपको बताता हूं कि जैसे ही आप क्लासरूम में एंटर करते हैं, लेट्स से यू आर फर्स्ट ईयर स्टूडेंट, तो आप में से कितने ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट में से हैं यहां पे? तो आधे बचे हुए हैं यहां पे. बिकॉज ये जो वायरस है, वोक वायरस, ये साइंस डिपार्टमेंट को इतना इफेक्ट नहीं करता, और ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट में आपको फर्स्ट डे ही वोक की टीचिंग शुरू हो जाती है. और इस टीचिंग के कुछ जो वर्ड्स हैं स्टार्टिंग के, वो मैं शेयर करना चाहता हूं. एक लिस्ट मैंने आशुतोष जी के साथ भी शेयर करी, आशुतोष भैया जी के साथ में. इंटरप्रिटेशन, पर्सपेक्टिव, कैटेगरीज, डाइवर्सिटी, इक्वालिटी. आई एम रिपीटिंग. इंटरप्रिटेशन, पर्सपेक्टिव, कैटेगरीज, डाइवर्सिटी, इक्वालिटी. जैसे ही विद्यार्थी कक्षा में जाता है ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट में, सोशियोलॉजी, एंथ्रोपोलॉजी, व्हाटएवर सब्जेक्ट्स, तो उसको ये फील कराया जाता है कि अगर आपको ह्यूमैनिटीज में कटिंग एज रिसर्च करनी है और आपको एजुकेटेड फील करवाना है अपने आप को, और आपके रिसर्च पेपर को ऐसा लगना चाहिए कि किसी इंटेलेक्चुअल ने लिखा है, तो हर दूसरी या तीसरी लाइन में ये वर्ड्स आने चाहिए, देन यू विल बी कॉल्ड एज एन इंटेलेक्चुअल। अब ये एक प्रॉब्लम है क्योंकि देखिए साइंस डिपार्टमेंट को कॉन्ट्रास्ट कीजिए, साइंस डिपार्टमेंट में अगर आप बायोलॉजी में है तो जेनेटिक्स में एक फ्रंटियर्स पे काम चल रहा है और यू डू समथिंग एम्पेरिकल स्टडीज, और आप रिसर्च करते हैं, एम्पेरिकल स्टडीज करते हैं, कोट करते हैं। आप न्यूरो साइंसेस में हैं तो फ्रंटियर्स में कुछ काम हो रहा है। नाउ व्हाट टू डू इन ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट विच दे कैन कॉल एज कटिंग एज रिसर्च? क्लासिकल स्टडीज तो आपने सब बाहर निकाल दी हैं, कॉलिंग इट एज रबिश, कॉलिंग इट एज superstitious, barbaric, primitive. So there is nothing as classical subjects that you are teaching in humanities department. So because of your hate towards classical studies, because of your hate towards past tradition, spirituality, there is nothing in humanities department that belongs to this area. So the question left is, suppose you are a student of humanities department, आप कैसे प्रूव करेंगे कि आप 21st सेंचुरी में ह्यूमैनिटीज में कुछ कंट्रीब्यूशन कर रहे हैं? ये शब्दों से स्टूडेंट्स को ये फील कराया जाता है कि आप इनको कोट करें। आई विल गिव यू माय प्रैक्टिकल एग्जांपल। ऑफन स्टूडेंट्स अप्लाई फॉर पीएचडी इन आवर यूनिवर्सिटी, और खासकर जैसे मैंने कहा ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट में जैसे ही अप्लाई करते हैं तो इंग्लिश डिपार्टमेंट, कल्चरल स्टडीज और सोशल स्टडीज, इसमें तो जब भी प्रेजेंटेशन होता है पीएचडी कैंडिडेट का, तब उनकी उतनी कॉम्प्लेक्स पीपीटी होती है कि मेरे को डिकोड करना पड़ता है कि ये क्या कहना चाह रहे हैं। आई एम गोइंग टू बी देयर सुपरवाइजर, ओके, एंड दे यूज ऑल सॉर्ट्स ऑफ जार्गन्स, स्लोगन्स, एकेडमिक वोकैबुलरी दैट आई हैव टू फिगर आउट। तो ऐसा ही एक किस्सा थोड़े आई थिंक 1 years अगो पहले हुआ। जो कैंडिडेट था वो बंगाल से था, उसने अपना ऑनलाइन प्रेजेंटेशन दिया, इंग्लिश में उसको पीएचडी करनी है। जस्ट थिंक अबाउट द सिनेरियो हियर। उसने पूरा प्रेजेंटेशन दिया, हर दूसरी स्लाइड में वहां पे वर्ड मेंशन था सबऑल्टर्न, कंस्ट्रक्शन, डीकंस्ट्रक्शन, इंटरसेक्शनैलिटी, ठीक है। हाफ एन आवर के प्रेजेंटेशन के बाद मैंने उससे पूछा कि भैया आपको करना क्या है, मुझे सिंपल भाषा में बता दो आप। मतलब आपका रिसर्च टॉपिक क्या है? जस्ट रिमूव ऑल दीज जार्गन्स, ओके, एंड टेल मी व्हाट यू वांट टू डू। फिर उसने बताया, मैंने कहा फॉरगेट अबाउट इंग्लिश, फॉरगेट अबाउट एनी अदर लैंग्वेज, जस्ट टेल मी इन सिंपल लैंग्वेज व्हाट इज योर टॉपिक। एंड यू वोंट बिलीव दैट हिज टॉपिक वाज कि इंडिया का जो फोक आर्ट है वो हमारी माइथोलॉजी से कैसे इंस्पायर है, उसको वो मैप करना चाहता है। तो मैंने उससे पूछा कि ये सब शब्द क्यों लिखे हैं, इसका तो कोई मीनिंग ही नहीं है यहाँ पे। तो उसका कहना था कि नहीं सर, ऐसा मुझे कहा गया है मेरी फैकल्टी ने कि अगर रिसर्च पेपर को अगर सेलेक्ट करवाना है और पीएचडी में अगर एडमिशन चाहिए तो ये सारे शब्द होने चाहिए उसमें। सो ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस कि ह्यूमैनिटीज डिपार्टमेंट, इंग्लिश, कल्चरल स्टडीज, एंथ्रोपोलॉजी, सोशियोलॉजी, व्हाटएवर यू हैव, they have very inferiority complex when they look at the science departments. उन्हें लगता है कि यहां तो 21st सेंचुरी में कुछ हाईटेक कुछ चल रहा है, तो हमें भी तो 21st सेंचुरी की हाईटेक थ्योरीज देनी होंगी। So they brought this whole idea of wokeism. I'll go into the details कि हिस्टोरिकली कैसे इवॉल्व हुआ, पर मैं एक स्टोरी भी आपके साथ शेयर करना चाहता हूं, क्योंकि आज जब मैंने फीडबैक लिया आशुतोष जी से और वैभव से कि आज जो पैरेलल सेशन था उसमें एक क्वेश्चन था कि ये कंफ्यूजन है कि क्या प्रोटेस्ट गलत है, तो प्रोटेस्ट कल्चर क्यों गलत है फिर, क्योंकि सत्याग्रह हमारे यहाँ पे भी होते थे। ऑफ कोर्स संदीप राइटली पॉइंटेड आउट दैट वेरेवर यू हैव इटर्नल प्रोटेस्ट इट कैन नॉट बी कॉल्ड कल्चर, इट इज ए मशीनरी टू डीकल्चर सोसाइटी, नॉट टू कल्टिवेट एंड कल्चर्ड सोसाइटी। तो एक कहानी है महाभारत की, एक कैरेक्टर है महाभारत में, आपने सुना होगा, उसका नाम है बर्बरिक। आप में से कितने लोगों को पता है कि बर्बरिक एक कैरेक्टर है महाभारत में? ओह, दैट्स क्वाइट गुड, वेरी इंप्रेसिव। तो बर्बरिक की कहानी का एक इंटरेस्टिंग एस्पेक्ट है विच आई ऑलवेज रिलेट विथ वोक एक्टिविस्ट। बर्बरिक घटोत्कच के पुत्र थे, घटोत्कच भीम के पुत्र थे। हमें यह पता है कि बर्बरिक को वरदान था कि वो दो ही बाण में पूरा का पूरा जो वॉर कहीं पे भी चल रही हो उसको पूरा चेंज कर सकता है। whichever side he will fight with or against, he will completely turn around the fate of the war. Okay? तो बर्बरिक जब ये पता चला कि कुरुक्षेत्र में वॉर चल रही है और कौरव और पांडवों के बीच में, तो वहां पे जाने लगे। अब उसमें इंटरेस्टिंग बात यह है कि उनकी माता ने उनको एक ही शिक्षा दी थी कि जो भी वीकर हो उसका साथ देना है। जो भी वीकर है, जो कमजोर है, हमको उसका साथ देना चाहिए। अब ये वैसे बहुत नोबल टीचिंग है, इसको कौन डिनाई कर सकता है? सपोज इफ आई टेल यू दैट यू शुड ऑलवेज फाइट फॉर वीकर पीपल, ओके, फॉर वीकर सेक्शन ऑफ सोसाइटी, विल यू डिसएग्री विथ मी? अब यही टीचिंग लेके वो महाभारत के युद्ध में जाने लगे। और जब कृष्ण को ये पता था कि ये जब वहां पहुंचेंगे, और उस समय महाभारत में ये हो रहा था कि कौरव हार रहे थे और पांडव जीत रहे थे, तो बर्बरिक ने ये सोचा कि क्योंकि कौरव हार रहे हैं और मेरी मां ने कहा था कि जो भी हार रहा हो या जो भी वीक हो उसका साथ देना है। जब रास्ते में जब वो जा रहे होते हैं तो श्री कृष्ण को ये पता चल जाता है कि बर्बरिक आ रहा है, और अगर बर्बरिक ने अगर कौरवों का साथ दिया तो कौरव जीत जाएंगे और पांडव हार जाएंगे। तो बर्बरिक स्टोरी ऐसी है कि इट गोज लाइक दिस कि श्री कृष्ण ने जाके रोका और ये सब क्वेरी करी कि तुम कहाँ जा रहे हो, कौन हो, क्या हो। वो कृष्ण जो है वो ब्राह्मण का वेश बना के गए। बर्बरिक को समझाने की कोशिश करी कि नहीं, जो तुम स्टैंड ले रहे हो कि मैं कौरवों का साथ दूंगा और पांडवों को हरा दूंगा, ये गलत है। एंड कृष्ण ट्राइड टू रीजन विथ हिम दैट वॉट एवर यू आर प्लानिंग टू डू with your teaching that you are going to fight for those who are weaker, it will cause the much larger damage in society later on. But he did not budge. He said that I will do as my mother said, because that is the only teaching I know. नहीं मानते हैं, कृष्ण को सुदर्शन चक्र निकाल के उन्हें बिहेड करना पड़ता है। ठीक है, एंड फिर उसकी स्टोरी आगे है। Now you tell me whether Barbaric was right or Shri Krishna was right. तालियां नहीं बजानी, जवाब भी देने। बोथ आर राइट। तो फिर सुदर्शन चक्र कैसे चलेगा? बोथ आर राइट। तो look, this confusion that is there in your mind when you will read the story of Barbaric, you will find the nuances of dharma here. इसलिए महाभारत जब पढ़ते हैं और समझने की कोशिश करते हैं तो ये बार बार कहा जाता है कि धर्म के कई मीनिंग होते हैं, कई न्यूएंसेस होते हैं, एंड इट्स नॉट एज इजी एज वी अंडरस्टैंड। बर्बरिक की स्टोरी हमें ये बताती है कि कैसे एक नोबल इंटेंशन के साथ, एक गुड आइडियाज के साथ आप डिस्ट्रक्शन कर सकते हो सोसाइटी का। इफ श्री कृष्ण हैड नॉट स्टॉप्ड बर्बरिक, व्हाट वुड हैव हैपेंड? जस्ट थिंक अबाउट दैट। कौरव जीत जाते, पांडव हार जाते, एंड व्हाट वुड हैव हैपेंड लेटर ऑन? पूरा अधर्म का राज होता। सो विद दोज हु आर थिंकिंग कि ठीक है प्रोटेस्ट ऐसे अच्छा है, तो ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट this good feeling can also be manipulated, can also be channelized in very dangerous direction also. This is the lesson of Barbaric story. So what I call is that woke or left liberal is suffering from Barbaric syndrome.
You're being too kind to them.
Huh?
You're being too kind to them. You are being too kind to them.
Yes, because of course he was blessed soul, he got moksha after that. So of course not after what he did after that or what he got after that, but of course meeting before Krishna, I think that is what captures the woke sentiment, Barbaric syndrome. I think we have to do now panel discussion and need to move ahead.
Okay.
Okay. Uh, so there are few questions for both of you.
Sure, sure.
Okay. Uh, uh, and then we will go for audience. Right? क्योंकि सौम्या डे जी का बहुत अच्छा अनुभव है जेएनयू में. ही इज प्रोडक्ट ऑफ जेएनयू. Okay. And he has seen, from very close quarter how JNU works and how students are indoctrinated, manipulated in JNU. Am I right? So can you please tell us that when students go, how they are indoctrinated and manipulated into theories of wokeism? Like, first day, first few days, what kind of interactions happen with teachers, teachers and students, and how teachers approach to students? Any personal experience or you've seen it?
Definitely. I'll share my personal experiences too. And thank you very much, sir, for asking me this question. So back in my days, I joined JNU in 2004 in the MA program. I was in the Center for Historical Studies, which was the hub of a lot of insurrectionary activities in JNU. So in my days, indoctrination would literally have begin from day one. And by the way, I'll try to speak in Hindi when I think I can. What happens to me is that, I lose my fluency when I try to speak in Hindi. I do speak Hindi. I'll try to do that when I can. So in my days, JNU was completely left dominated. Left was not just dominant, it was hegemonic in JNU in those days. Left was the only point of view. And in those days, indoctrination of a young student would begin literally from day one. So you have cleared the entrance examination. It is time for you to come to campus, pay the fees, take up hostel accommodation, and join your course, begin classes in a couple of days. Let us say this is the situation. So you come to the campus and you go to the administration building to pay your fees. What would happen was that, there would be these leftist student groups, SFI, Students Federation of India, affiliated to CPIM, All India Students Association, affiliated to CPI, camping there, right outside, literally camping there. There were the pitch camps outside the administration building. And as you were entering the building, they would offer you assistance. Because the JNU literally has a Byzantine, labyrinthine bureaucracy. It is not easy to find the right counter at which to pay your fees. So they would offer you assistance. And once they have assisted you, you've filled up the forms, you've paid your fees, they will ask you, we are these group of students. They would say, we are these group of students, like-minded students. We sometimes meet up in our hostel rooms and conduct discussions on political, cultural issues. Would you like to join us? So you're a young student, you haven't made any friends yet in the university. Of course, generally you would say yes, of course. You want a circle of friends. So once you join this group, let us say it is SFI or ISA, they would begin working on your mind. They would try to stoke a sense of victimhood in you. And they would find a way to do that. For example, you come from a certain region of the country. Let us say you come from a very poor district, Kalahandi. You come from the northeast, and you feel neglected. Let us say you do. There isn't much development in your part of India. So they would say that, it is because of your ethnicity, it is because of the language you speak, it is because of your cultural orientation, the center is deliberately neglecting you. So they would introduce these fragmentary points of view. They would introduce these fault lines in your mind. Or you might have some personal issues, some issues in your family. Let us say you're not getting along so well with your parents. And it typically happens with 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, that is a period of life, that is a point of our lives when most of us, or a lot of us, have issues with our parents. We have differences with our parents. So they would, in this case, begin to undermine the institution of family itself. These leftists would say that the institution of family is the problem in this case. It is a patriarchal, it suffocates, adolescent aspirations. So they would, in this case, they try to undermine the traditional value sets, which uphold the family, uphold the institution of the family. So they would begin to work on your mind in these ways. And they would encourage you to let go completely, take to hedonism. Well, weed parties used to happen in JNU in those days, and hedonism appeals to adolescents in certain cases. So they would as I said, encourage you to let go, encourage you to privilege your impulses, your appetites over your duties, over responsibilities, and thus, once again, they would undermine your inherited value sets. Undermining of inherited value sets is something that the leftists would do very commonly. They would liberate you in this way, because they would tell you repeatedly that these traditional value sets are oppressive. And this departure, this radical departure, this radical undermining of traditional value sets is a very common phenomenon in the trend, in the civil society trend that we call wokeism, isn't it? It's all about discarding, undermining the traditional value sets and privileging impulse and emotions over the traditional value sets. So this is something that the leftists would do very often. In fact, commonly in those days, and it appealed to a lot of young people. They would feel that they have a valid reason to let go. So these are certain ways in which leftists used to indoctrinate and work on young minds. And then again, there were the teachers. JNU had a lot of teachers in those days who were not quite professors. I would call them political commissars. I'm making a very, very controversial statement in this case. Now, let me explain to you what the role of the political commissar was in the days of the Soviet Union, or rather the heydays of communism, global communism. So, in the Soviet Union, as far as I know, every regiment of the army, every division would have a political commissar attached to it. If you watched this film set against the Second World War in Stalingrad, what is the name of it? Enemy at the Doors. Has anyone watched this film? It's a very good war movie, by the way. So this film begins the narrative at a point when the Soviets are losing against the Germans. They're in a very, very messy situation in the Battle of Stalingrad. And the Soviet army, the Red Army, is retreating, ceding ground to the German army repeatedly. And at a point in the narrative, Khrushchev arrives on the scene. He's a political commissar, and he gently persuades, in typical Soviet fashion, to persuades the general in charge of the sector to commit suicide, and he gives, again, delivers a delicate Soviet pep talk to the soldiers who are fighting in this sector. Anyway, so what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there were political commissars attached to regiments and divisions of the Soviet Red Army, and they politically indoctrinated the soldiers. As far as I know, there were similar political commissars on the collective farms and in the state-owned enterprises. So a lot of professors in JNU in those days used to play the role of political commissars. They would literally indoctrinate students in the classroom. They would indoctrinate students against, once again, family values, the traditional inherited value sets, against the Indian state, terming it oppressive, terming it Brahminical, and what have you. So indoctrination used to happen on both fronts, outside the classroom and inside the classroom. It was a two-pronged attack upon young minds.
Wonderful. I request all of you to do more interaction with Saumya ji, because he has first-hand experience of how to come out from woke trap and fight against them also. और जैसा सौम्या जी ने कहा कि सबसे पहले आपकी वैल्यू सिस्टम पे अटैक किया जाता है, और वो वैल्यू सिस्टम स्पिरिचुअल भी हो सकती है, कल्चरल भी हो सकती है, फैमिली वैल्यू सिस्टम भी हो सकता है, बिकॉज until and unless they cut you from all these traditional aspects, you will not be converted into their ideologies. तो ये पहला मुझे लगता है कि ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट वर्क होता है कि स्टेप बाय स्टेप आपको अपनी कल्चरल रूट से डिसएसोसिएट किया जा सके. लेट्स मूव टू संदीप नाउ. Sandeep, any more comments you would like to have? Like just, before I ask you questions.
I'll just give an anecdote since you're on the topic of JNU, and because it's so irresistible. So this was at the height of peak of the communist student wing in JNU, maybe in the 80s. Arun Shauri was once invited to deliver a lecture on something about some communist theory or some nonsense like that. So, as usual, he understood all the tricks that they were playing. So, he came in a car and opened the trunk full of books and files, all written by communists. And as soon as he entered the hall, he piled all the books on the table, and then he said, I am going to read out works and stuff from what your own comrades have written, so you understand how hollow this is. So complete pandemonium erupted and they didn't let him speak. Obviously, they'll shout you down. Remember one thing, all these, this woke brigade, they will never engage with you in a logical debate. They won't. They will either shout you down or, this so-called protest culture, that they'll do. So back to this story. So they shouted him down. He was completely calm. He said, "Are you done?" And then one elderly man began to abuse him. So he listened to the abuse and he said, "Sir, how old are you?" So that guy, he was thrown off balance. So he said, "What does my age have to do with, my question or something?" So Arun Shauri said, "I asked your age because I wanted to know if you were contaminated or you are the one actually doing the contaminating." Oh, this was an anecdote.
Sandeep, I think you can also speak Hindi quite a bit. Maybe
No,
you can
people-
try.
People will laugh at me.
People, okay. So let me ask you this question, because now there is this huge machinery working to propagate this woke agenda. And our universities, especially humanities department, taken over by them. I think you wrote wonderful article where you showed the nexus between university, NGOs, and American, universities. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. This nexus actually begins with Frankfurt School, which Saumya ji mentions. So that's the other thing they do very well from day one. They come up with all these innocuous sounding, very innocent and noble sounding terminology. Institute for Social Studies. Do you associate this with a far left ideology? No, right? Like how Christian NGOs do this, right? Compassion International. It's not Compassion International, like, one of Mother Teresa's victims said, please ask your Jesus to stop kissing me. It hurts. So this is how they do this. I mean, it's borrowed from the same tactics, from the same playbook. So it pretty much began with the Frankfurt School. And what they did was that they studied society. Instead of taking over the world through economic means as, class warfare, they began to study the society and found out that the individual family unit was at the root of all the problem. So how do you break the family unit? To break it, you demonize the man, right? The head of the family who's associated with being a man traditionally. So call him authoritarian. So a book came out, remind me of the author, I might get it wrong. The Authoritarian Personality, there's a book, I forget the name of the author. So that book pretty much says that the male member of the family, the breadwinner, the guy who rears the family, he is at the root of all problems. So he has an innately barbaric and authoritarian tendency with him, inside him, which causes wars, which causes conquests. So break him. He is the central villain of the society. So how do you break him? You instigate the female members of the family against him, which is the wife. So these were deliberately written, fat books were written which propagated the whole thing. And fast forward, after the end of Second World War, this theory, a bunch of all these troublemakers, rogues basically, they were all, fat cat communists from Europe. They migrated to the US and they, began their propaganda in various universities, chiefly Columbia and UC Berkeley much later. So there they began to break the American society using this formula from within the society itself. So as a result, one critical or decisive stage was reached in the 1960s, which is the beginning of all this problem. That decade has not been studied as thoroughly and as seriously as it should be, at least in India. In the West, a lot of studies have been, they've come out. So this poison began to be spread. So by the mid-60s, something called a sexual revolution happened on the university campuses of US. What do you mean sexual revolution? Meaning young men and women, students basically, right? They have to be allowed to have free sex on campus. this was unthinkable. It was called a revolution. See, what I come back to this protest revolution, it creates instability in the society. So that led to an epidemic of, pregnancies, unwed mothers, this kind of thing. Step by step, the family system was broken. So that put a pressure on economy. And then that led to the divorce epidemic. And beach mein, because you have this, unrestricted, unrestrained free sex, they call it a culture again. Okay, free sex is a culture. So all this also led again to the rise of what is known as a radical feminism. So this could not happen in isolation. So this began with the academia on university campuses, produced, directed, and often funded by academics. And then they begin to, what they do is that when they create the next generation of students or academics in their own mold, these guys also become professors committed to that kind of ideology. Right? And what they do is they tie the careers of the students, unless, I think Ramji mentioned that, हमको अगर इसमें PhD करना है, तो ये सब keywords.
You have to write
so
that.
this keyword
Yes.
nonsense begins there. So they kept doing that. So as a result, by the 80s, 1980s, late 80s, you had 2.5 generations of this breed. And they began occupying. So you create generations of these, woke machines by indoctrinating them at a very early age. And they also control the levers to funding, government funding. And you create, you catch hold of some kind of a legislator or a senator or somebody and say that, look, this demographic is, I can give you this demographic, they'll vote for you. So that's how they build a nice network. Then the NGO guys will come who will follow the same kind of, ideology. And essentially what they're doing is that they are using our children as cannon fodder. You don't become human beings once you emerge from, this kind of indoctrination. You become weapons without your own knowledge. Because you don't know any other thing. This is the only thing that you know. So I think that pretty much explains it.
No, that historical background is important, since I think after World War II, they begin to have all these indoctrination. Yes. And as you also mentioned, कि ग्राम्शी की जो थ्योरी है एंटोनियो ग्राम्शी की कल्चरल हेजेमनी, I'll quote Herbert Marcuse also here. Look, एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन है, आप लोगों को ध्यान रखना चाहिए कि जब कम्युनिज्म और सोशलिज्म फेल हुआ 20th सेंचुरी में, तो सबसे बड़ा क्वेश्चन था, क्योंकि इट वाज प्रोपिगेटेड फॉर 100 years एज ए ग्रैंड थ्योरी कि ये तो उटोपिया ले आएगा और हेवन ऑन अर्थ आ जाएगा. तो जब वो फेल हुआ तो क्वेश्चन ये था कि ये फेल क्यों हुआ, इसमें कुछ कमी रह गई है इसलिए ये फेल हुआ है. रादर देन एक्सेप्टिंग दैट द फाउंडेशन इज रॉन्ग, दे थॉट कि इकोनॉमिक रेवोल्यूशन से काम नहीं चलेगा, अब हमें और डीपर जाना होगा और कल्चरल रेवोल्यूशन लेके आना होगा. और कल्चरल रेवोल्यूशन के लिए हार्बर्ट मर्क्यूस ने जो कोट दिया है वो ये है उस समय कम्युनिज्म के लिए कि आई डोंट थिंक इट्स डेड, आई डोंट थिंक दैट कम्युनिज्म इज डेड and it will resurrect in the universities. Now look at the profundity and look at the vision. They are not ready to accept that communism has any flaws. They are saying कि हमने वर्कर्स और फार्मर के बीच में जो लेके गए, इससे ये रेवोल्यूशन नहीं आएगा. रेवोल्यूशन आएगा जब हम यूनिवर्सिटीज कैप्चर करेंगे, स्कूल्स और कॉलेजेस कैप्चर करेंगे और वहां पे करिकुलम को हम अपने हाथ में लेंगे. उनका कहना है कि वर्कर्स लेजी हैं, फार्मर लेजी हैं, ये रेवोल्यूशन लेके नहीं आ सकते. सो आवर नेक्स्ट टारगेट शुड बी डीपर एंड दैट शुड बी स्टूडेंट्स एंड फैकल्टी. वी मस्ट कीप दैट इन माइंड दैट दिस इज नॉट समथिंग स्पॉन्टेनियस एंड ग्रेजुअली इवॉल्विंग. ये बहुत सिस्टमैटिकली प्लान करके नेक्स्ट स्टेज पे बिल्ड किया गया है. मैं 2 मिनट और लूंगा, फिर क्वेश्चन आंसर पे हम आते हैं. एक हिस्टोरिकल बैकग्राउंड देने के लिए सिर्फ, जैसा कि मेरे साथियों ने कहा कि ये कोई नया फिनोमेना नहीं है, पर ये फिनोमेना ऑलमोस्ट 2000 years बैक क्रिश्चियनिटी से शुरू होता है. एक्चुअली ये जो क्रांति का मेनिया है, आई कॉल इट रेवोल्यूशन मेनिया, सिंस द एडवेंट ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी, सिंस द बर्थ ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी. लेट मी गिव यू 4 एग्जाम्पल्स फॉर दैट. पहला रेवोल्यूशन, पहली क्रांति जो यूरोप में आई, वो थी क्रिश्चियनिटी जो लेके आना चाहती थी, वो थी रिलीजियस रेवोल्यूशन. कि ये जो स्पिरिचुअलिटी है ये सब बेकार है एंशिएंट ग्रीस की, ये पोलिथिज्म, गॉडेस वर्शिप, गॉड्स वर्शिप, रिचुअल्स, जब तक ये नहीं हटेगा तब तक समाज में पीस नहीं होगी, तब तक समाज में इक्वालिटी नहीं होगी. तो रिलीजियस रेवोल्यूशन लेके आना जरूरी है. इसके लिए उन्होंने सारा पैगन ट्रेडिशन को पूरा का पूरा डिस्ट्रॉय कर दिया. दैट वाज द फर्स्ट रेवोल्यूशन and that disrupted the whole European society for next 2000 years, and still it is disrupted. Second revolution था French Revolution, संदीप ने बात करी, and that was political revolution. उन्होंने कहा कि religious revolution से काम नहीं चलेगा, अब हमको तख्ता पलट करना पड़ेगा, राजाओं को बदलना पड़ेगा और political revolution लेके आना पड़ेगा. And that happened in 18th century. Just look at the step. Third came economic revolution with experiment in Russia and China, that is called Russian Revolution. Again यही premise कि जब तक economic factor of production change नहीं हो जाएंगे तब तक heaven on earth नहीं आएगा, तब तक equality नहीं आएगी, तब तक समाज पूरा बदल नहीं जाएगा. That also failed. All of these failed. Christian religious revolution failed. Dark ages came in Europe. Second, French Revolution came and it created disaster in France. Then Russian Revolution came. We know the genocide happened in Russia and China. Read the Black Book of Communism. 20 करोड़ लोगों को मारा है इस रेवोल्यूशन के नाम पे 20th century में. Religious, political, social, now they are aiming at the more dangerous and the more sophisticated version of this revolution, and that is what they call cultural revolution. So do not think कि ये कोई नई थ्योरी है, नई उसकी टर्मिनोलॉजी है, वोकैबुलरी है, सोफिस्टिकेशन है, बट ये यूरोप का रेवोल्यूशन मेनिया है जो पिछले 2000 साल से कंटिन्यूअसली चला आ रहा है. इसके 5 कैरेक्टरिस्टिक हैं. मुझे लगता है श्रीवास्तव जी ने जब मोनोथीज्म डिस्कस किया होगा आज. एक तो है डिसमेंटल एवरीथिंग. सेकंड, हेटिंग पास्ट, ट्रेडिशन, हिस्ट्री. क्योंकि जब तक आप ट्रेडिशन, हिस्ट्री और पास्ट को हेट नहीं करोगे तब तक, जो थर्ड फैक्टर है, यूटोपिया कोई फ्यूचर में लेके आना है, तब तक आपको उस पर बिलीव नहीं होगा. आपको ऐसी सोसाइटी बनानी है जिसमें दूध दही की नदियां बहेंगी और हेवन ऑन अर्थ हो जाएगा. उसके लिए पहले आपको आपके पास्ट से हेट करना पड़ेगा, ट्रेडिशन से हेट करना पड़ेगा. सो द थर्ड पॉइंट इज उटोपिया. एंड उटोपियन थिंकिंग इज not dharmic thinking. Utopian thinking is revolutionary thinking of Europe. Fourth is you have to create atrocity literature for that. Past को, tradition को आपको hate करने के लिए ऐसा literature बनाना पड़ेगा जिसमें आपके पूर्वजों से आपको घृणा होने लगे, आपकी पूरी परंपरा से आपको घृणा होने लगे. तो atrocity literature उसका part है. And last is having some Satan or demon at one point of time. क्योंकि आप कितना भी इस रेवोल्यूशन को एम कर ले, ये आएगा नहीं, क्योंकि प्रैक्टिकल नहीं है. ये वैसा ही है जैसे मिडिल ईस्ट में शरिया लाने की कोशिश की जा रही है पिछले 1400 साल से, पर आज तक कोई भी मिडिल ईस्ट कंट्री शरिया 100% इंप्लीमेंट नहीं कर सकी. इसीलिए डीमन और सैटन का आविष्कार किया जाता है. इसीलिए वो डीमनाइज और सैटनाइज ही करते रहते हैं अपने एनिमीज को. ये एक पूरा हिस्टोरिकल नरेशन जब हम देखेंगे तो समझ में आएगा ये जो रेवोल्यूशनरी थिंकिंग है ये इंडिक अप्रोच या धार्मिक अप्रोच नहीं है. हमारी जो अप्रोच है वो रिफॉर्म की अप्रोच है. राइट. सो आई थिंक विद दिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट एंड बैकग्राउंड इन माइंड, जो कि सौम्या जी ने भी शेयर किया, संदीप जी ने भी शेयर किया, आई थिंक द टाइम इज टू ओपन फॉर टू गो फॉर ऑडियंस टू हैव क्वेश्चन एंड आंसर फ्रॉम यू. Whatever mechanism we have here. Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Please tell your name
Yeah.
and whom you are addressing.
So, Dhanyavad, respected panelists, for the insightful session. It was, quite an informative and eye-opening discussion. जो आपने nuances discuss किए हैं, जो कीवर्ड्स डिस्कस किए हैं सच एज जेंडर जस्टिस, फेमिनिज्म, प्रोपेगेंडा, एनजीओज, कल्चरल रेवोल्यूशन, पॉलिटिकल फिलोसफीज, ये निश्चित ही हम सभी में एक विचारधारा की जो हमारी बातें हैं उसमें एक नया आयाम लाएंगी और जो ज्ञान का प्रवाह है वो लगातार बहता रहेगा. हम क्वेश्चन आंसर्स में मूव करते हैं. आई वुड रिक्वेस्ट जो वॉलंटियर्स है, ड्यू टू द पॉसिटी ऑफ द टाइम हम बहुत ज़्यादा क्वेश्चंस नहीं ले पाएंगे. प्लीज़ अपने क्वेश्चंस को ब्रीफ रखिए, प्रिसाइज रखिए और प्लीज़ वी कैन बिगिन. डू वी हैव द माइक?
जी.
Yeah, please. We can start from there at the end. At the end.
वापस और माइक, और माइक फ्लोट करवा दो
Just a minute.
क्योंकि तीनों रो में क्वेश्चन.
Hello, sir. My name is Arpan Saxena, and I'm a.
Right.
It's
Please
fine.
go ahead. Yes,
All right.
yes.
So my name is Arpan Saxena. I'm a human resource professional, and I think any of you can answer this question. To ask this question, I need to discuss a scenario to set the context with your permission. I'll just take 30 seconds. So,
Just take 10 seconds.
Sure. During the evaluation cycle, we identify there are few people who are not performing, and they keep asking for some time to improve. But at the time of appraisal, they play a victim card. So in a social and political scenario, how to address these people during the evaluation cycle only, before they become protesters and they start playing a victim card of.
Look, I got your question. ये ऐसा नहीं है कि कोई प्रोटेस्टर बन नहीं पाया, उसकी बात नहीं सुनी और वो वोकिस्ट बन गया. ये डिफरेंस, क्योंकि बर्बरिक की स्टोरी से आप समझ लीजिए, जिसको सोसाइटी में रिफॉर्म्स लेके आने होते हैं वो सेवा का भाव रखता है, ठीक है, और वो अपने आप रिफॉर्म करता है सोसाइटी. और सोसाइटी का रिफॉर्म, देखिए पहली बात तो ये है ना, हमने अपने पे ले लिया है कि हम रिफॉर्म कर देंगे सोसाइटी पे. और देखिए प्रोटेस्ट कल्चर तभी होगा जब आप राइट बेस्ड सोसाइटी पे बात करेंगे. ड्यूटी बेस्ड सोसाइटी पे बात करेंगे तो प्रोटेस्ट की बात नहीं होगी. तो ये जो ट्रांजिशन है ये होता नहीं है. दोज हु प्रोटेस्ट एंड दोज हु बिलीव इन इटर्नल प्रोटेस्ट, they cannot be reformed in that manner. They have certain agenda. That's what we are pointing at again and again. संदीप ने कहा कि उनके साथ कोई डिस्कोर्स या डिस्कशन नहीं किया जाता. You just go and meet them and talk to them. They will say that we are not interested in discussion. क्योंकि आप अप्रेसर हैं, आप कैसे डिस्कशन कर सकते हैं हमारे साथ? आपको एक्सपीरियंस ही नहीं है, लिव्ड एक्सपीरियंस ही नहीं है. They'll come all these stuff. जिसको सोसाइटी में रिफॉर्म लेके आना आता है वो सोसाइटी के बीच में काम करता है सेवा भाव से और अपने आप रिफॉर्म लेके आ जाता है. वो प्रोटेस्ट और इटर्नल प्रोटेस्ट इस पे कोई विश्वास नहीं करता. So please don't fall for that trap.
Hello, here sir. My name is Shubh Anam, and my question is, we discussed on history and background of Wokeism, and I got a pretty good idea about it, but we have not discussed on what should be the response. So it is now infiltrating the schools also and minds of young people through social media and OTT and everything. So what should be academic or social response, or how can we respond as a society?
I think Sandeep, you can take this.
Yeah,
He has been.
it's an unpopular opinion, but it is my conviction that middle class Hindu parents especially should not send children to English schools. You have crossed that barrier long back. Because if you put them in these schools, by the time, they come to the 10th standard or something, they are gone. They'll begin to regard their own parents as enemies. There is no academic or, political solution to this. What you can perhaps do is that we had a certain generation, and I would like to believe that generation still exists, where there are some things about your culture that cannot be taught through books or lectures. You have to imbibe them, and to imbibe them from the general environment, that environment has to be kept intact. This is what I meant when I said, a certain element of stability and order is very much important to, conserve these things. So if you send them to, all these social science teachers are basically, they should not be in schools. They should not be teaching in schools. They should be in asylums. So I'm being serious. I'm being serious. You should look at the kind of syllabus and lessons that they write. It's alarming actually. तो ये घर से आपका ये हो सकता है. Only, in the true sense, parents have to protect their children, by ensuring that they're firmly attached to the roots, and even more importantly, to instill a sense of cultural self-confidence at a very, very young age. So I don't know, some people might not like this answer, but this is a truth that I have realized.
Right.
Okay, hello.
Let's go for the next one.
We just have a space for 2 more questions. So, please, yeah.
So we'll be here after this session also. We can have interaction after this formal session. Okay, it's over.
So, one final question. I am Vedant Tiwari, 5th year law student from School of Law, DAV, Indore. So, the natural offspring of wokeism and protest culture is selective outrage. So, my question to you, kind sirs, is that since everyone has sovereignty over their thoughts, how do we fundamentally tackle the problem where a Protestant decides what should be fought against and what not, at the behest of political benefits rather than morality?
Saumya?
Well, the response could be a positivist one, in my opinion. I hope you understand what I mean by positivism in this case. Coming from the discipline of history, it is a documentary evidence. I suppose one ought to throw as much documentary evidence, contrary documentary evidence, in the face of these protesters as possible. I try to do that in academic spaces as far as possible. For instance, this discourse, which is being promoted for several decades now, that Buddhism is completely contrary to Hinduism, and that Buddhism is progressive while Hinduism is regressive, and so on. And there have been some conversions, I hear, in Delhi, during which, the people converting to Buddhism, individuals converting to Buddhism, vowed not to worship the Hindu deities. So in this case, what can be the response? I come from Tripura, for example, the northeast, where there is a tribe, an entire tribe which is Buddhist, the Chakmas. So I would tell these people that the Chakmas worship all Hindu deities, be it Shiva, be it Krishna. So I suppose one ought to throw as much documentary evidence in the face of these protesters as possible. And the thing about woke protest is that, it is not about providing alternative value sets. It is not about providing alternative programs, and never think that. It is about discarding all value sets, discarding all programs. And let me illustrate further what I'm trying to say here with some art history. For example, in the 19th century, we had these trends in painting, these art trends, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which contested the supposed, the putative, bourgeois canons, bourgeois aesthetic canons. And there were similar trends in the early 20th century, for example, the Dadaism and Cubism, which once again took on what these protagonists thought, the protagonists of these movements thought were bourgeois artistic canons. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that, in each instance, these contrary artistic trends had a definite program. They were furthering contrary artistic values, a set of coherent artistic values. But then when you come to postmodern art, it has no coherent set of values. Postmodern art is very shifty, it is very flighty, it is very whimsical. It resorts to both abstraction and figuration, as they say in art. So same with woke protests, it doesn't derive from coherent value sets. It is all about the promotion of subjectivities and whimsy. It is all about the promotion of entitled behavior. So this kind of protest in the long run serves no purpose, and the protagonists of these protests can serve no definite social purpose. So it is not sustainable in the long run, and a lot of it is going to peter out on its own, but of course after doing a lot of damage, which is why one has to deploy facts against these contrarians, these habitual contrarians.
So this is the last question, and मैं सभी से request करना चाहूँगा आप थोड़ी शांति बनाए रखिए, please.
Namaste everyone. My name is Vidulekha Tiwari, and my question is from Saumya Deji. So as people were mentioning, now the protest culture is entering into the technical institutions as well. And a couple of months ago in my institute, people started protesting against fee hike. And we were unable to reason with them and the topics, the subjects they were taking, they were even illogical. Like they could have taken logical topics, and even then the protest would have been like valid, but still they were not doing it. And we could not do anything about it. And my concern was that when I pass out of that institute, and I don't want someone to say after 20 years that this is the institute you are coming from and see what is going on there, and you must be of the same political mindset, something like that, what is going on with JNU right now. So I wanted suggestions on how to counter such protests in such institutions, such technical institutions.
Well, how to do that? As I said, one has to deploy facts against these habitual protesters. And one has to accept that beyond a point, probably you cannot argue against emotions. These protests are too emotional in their essential nature. And they are meant to be emotional, actually. These protests are in the form of an emotional self-indulgence. And how does one counter emotional self-indulgence beyond a point? One way is to ignore it, of course. So that once again it diffuses, it self-diffuses. And another way is to, as I've been saying, as I've been emphasizing throughout, to deploy facts against these habitual protesters. Because remember what I said a few moments ago, the idea behind these protests is not to provide programmatic alternatives. The idea is protest for its own sake. The idea is disruption. The idea is dismantling institutions, value sets. And again, a programmatic alternative is to display cohesion. And in this regard, I think cultural self-confidence can play a very valuable role. The kind of self-confidence which has been advocated by Sandeep ji here. So one has to be culturally rooted. One has to manifest the cultural self-confidence. One has to provide documentary evidence against these emotionalist protests. I suppose that these are certain alternatives that we can, or these are certain programmatic alternatives that we can resort to.
Just would like to add one point here. I think the common theme that is coming is how to fight against this wokeism or woke craft. Again, I take it from Ashutosh ji. Like the first session is about Purv Paksha, and the second session is Uttar Paksha. Okay. Until and unless you thoroughly understand your enemies, you cannot counter them. Understand their vocabulary, understand their jargons, understand their terminology, and it's not just one evening or one day or few days work. It requires hard work to be put into that. तो पूर्व पक्ष करें जिसको आपको लगता है कि ये अधार्मिक आइडियोलॉजीज हैं. अगर उसको सिस्टमैटिकली स्टडी नहीं किया है तो आप उनको काउंटर नहीं कर सकते हैं. दिस इज वेरी क्लियर. और उसमें आपको इन्वेस्टमेंट करना पड़ेगा, समय देना पड़ेगा, एंड दैट विल पे इट्स. यू विल फाइंड योर ओन सॉल्यूशंस वंस यू विल अंडरस्टैंड देम डीपली. तो ये हार्ड वर्क आप जरूर करें. डू नॉट गो बाय जस्ट स्लोगन, बाय हियरिंग एंड देयर एंड जस्ट स्टार्ट काउंटरिंग देम. दे आर वेरी सोफिस्टिकेटेड. They can look, if they have captured academia everywhere throughout the world, they are very smart people. So become as smart as them and then counter them. Thank you.
धन्यवाद. इट सीम्स लाइक बहुत सारे लोगों के कुछ प्रश्न रह गए, परंतु समय की कमी के कारण अभी हम नहीं कर सकते हैं यहाँ पे. आप ब्रेक में जो हमारे स्पीकर्स हैं उनसे इंटरेक्ट कर सकते हैं फॉर द सेम. मैं धन्यवाद प्रेषण की ओर बढ़ना चाहूँगा. सबसे पहले मैं धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा हमारे तीनों पैनलिस्ट्स को जिन्होंने अपना समय निकाला और यहाँ पे जो नैरेटिव आप
हम यही हैं अभी, आप तीनों यहीं पे हैं, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं.
थैंक यू. सो अ बिग थैंक यू टू ऑल द थ्री पैनलिस्ट्स हु वर प्रेजेंट हियर और जिन्होंने हमारा बहुत सारा ज्ञानवर्धन किया और जो चिंतन है उसके अंदर एक नई दिशा लाई. मैं यहाँ पर डेली कॉलेज की फैकल्टी, एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन और स्टाफ का भी धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा. साथ ही हमारे बीच में जो एस्टीम गेस्ट्स हैं, डिस्टिंग्विश गेस्ट्स हैं, मैं उन सभी का धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा और कंप्लीट वाईटीए फैमिली का धन्यवाद देना चाहूँगा. इस सेशन के बाद में आप पास में लेक के पास में एक डिनर ऑर्गेनाइज किया गया है, तो वहाँ पे जा सकते हैं. उसके पश्चात कल्चरल सेशन है जिसका आप सभी लुत्फ उठा सकते हैं. धन्यवाद.